So we've had the opportunity to explore some different cells under the microscope, and now we're going to talk about some cell theory and the history of how we discovered cells, and also some different types of cells. So cells are the basic unit of life. So everything that's living is made of cells. And it could be one cell, it could be many cells. So you can think of cells like bricks in a building, like Legos, and anything else that you can think of that, when you put it together, it builds something. So cell theory. Cells, again, are the basic unit of all living things. They're the smallest level of organization that is living. Anything smaller than that, atoms, molecules, organelles, they're not living on their own. So cells are that basic building block, the tiniest thing. And all cells come from existing cells. So cells were named by Robert Hooke in 1665. And the word cell means little room in Latin. And it came from when Hooke, as the story goes, looked at the cork tissue layer of trees, and he noticed that they looked like the little rooms in a monastery, where monks live in the Catholic religion, and they live in very simple little rooms, sort of in a line in a hallway, and so he called them cells because that's what those rooms were called. So here are some examples of different types of cells. So we have like our paramecium, we've looked at that under the microscope, that's a single-celled organism. Yeast, here are some yeast cells. E. coli bacteria, here are what those look like. You can see the flagella right here. A sperm and egg cells, so the sperm is one cell, the egg is a different cell, and then they combine. Pollen, here are pollen cells. Pollen is made of cells. Here's a nerve cell, and nerves are one of the longest cells. And we can find those obviously in the human body. And then here's Elodea. We looked at those under the microscope as well, and each one of these little rectangles is an Elodea cell, excuse me. So how many different types of cells are there? Well, in the human body alone, there are more than 200 different types of cells. So just totally different types. And then in the human body, there are approximately 10 to 100 trillion cells. So anywhere from 10 trillion to 100 trillion cells in the human body. And that's just in one person. So think about how many people there are on the planet and how many cells there are. And in each person, there are more than 200 different types of cells. So we're looking at cells. There are two main groups of cells, and so all cells are classified as one of two categories, either a eukaryotic cell or a prokaryotic cell. The main difference between a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell is that a eukaryotic cell has organized parts, or organelles, and specifically, they have a membrane-bound nucleus. So the DNA is found inside that nucleus, and the nucleus, we'll get into more details later, but that nucleus directs all the functions of the organelles in the cell. A prokaryotic cell, it has unorganized parts or organelles. It has no nucleus. So that's the biggest difference between the two, is that there's no nucleus in a prokaryotic cell, so this DNA is just sort of free-floating inside the cell. And so a good way to remember this is think of the P in prokaryotic as being primitive or old. And so pro, if we want to break down the word, pro means before, and karyotic refers to the nucleus. So these cells before nucleus, so they don't have a nucleus in them. Here's a picture. When we get into the kingdoms, There are two kingdoms that have prokaryotic cells, the eubacteria and the archaebacteria cells. They have prokaryotic cells. Their cells have no nucleus. They have a few cell parts, organelles, so they're a much simpler cell. The cells, we call it disorganized. So, for example, again, the DNA is just sort of a free-floating clump inside the cell. These are the smallest of cells. Reproduction in these cells is a simple process. The cell splits. It can happen as quickly as 15 minutes. And some people think that all life evolved from prokaryotic cells. That's one theory. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, if we break down the word eukaryotic, eu means true. Karyotic refers to the nucleus. So you think it has a true nucleus. So these are all cells except for bacteria. So all other cells have a nucleus. The only cells that don't, the only prokaryotic cells there are the types of bacteria. Eukaryotic cells have many organized structures or organelles. So they have a lot of parts. Each part does its own job. Each organelle does its own job. And that DNA is packaged inside the nucleus. So it is all contained inside this nucleus. Eukaryotic cells are larger in size. Reproduction in this type of cell is more complex. People think that these cells are more evolved, and so 4 of the 6 major classifications or kingdoms have organisms with eukaryotic cells. So when we're talking about the 6 kingdoms, the kingdoms of fungi, protist, plant and animal kingdoms, all of the organisms in those kingdoms have eukaryotic cells. So make sure you go back to Edmodo and do the Edmodo